Okay, well, how about we get started? I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel on does a defensible FCPA or anti-corruption compliance program, does a defensible one mean that it's also understood in the field? And I'm happy to welcome you. My name is Richard Bistrong. I'm the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery. And I'm happy to welcome my co-panelists, Jim Lord, a shareholder with Inman Flynn, Shari Brown, who's a partner with Troutman Sanders LLP, and Laura Perkins, who is the Assistant Chief of the FCPA unit at the Fraud Section of the Department of Justice. So thank you for everyone for joining us. And, you know, if we look into today's sort of compliance discourse and debate, we see a very robust discussion about what does the government want, what does the government expect of an anti-bribery compliance program. And the Department of Justice just recently released the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which provides some visibility as to the issues that the Department of Justice would want to address in the event of an investigation. But what got me started thinking about this panel was a discussion that I had about 3 years ago at an anti-bribery compliance conference. And during one of the breaks, I'm having a chat with a chief compliance officer. And she shares with me, she said, you know, Richard, I think we have a very robust compliance program, one that might even satisfy the regulators if there was ever an issue. But she said, what keeps me up at night is, does my team in the Middle East and Central Asia understand it? And that got me thinking, does a robust defensible program, one that might have been developed with a criminal law and preventative lens, mean that it's embraced and understood in the field as a partner to business success, particularly in what we often call frontier markets, where there can be a collision of commerce, corruption, and compliance. And, you know, my perspective on this issue comes as someone, I was an international sales vice president for a large defense contractor. I spent a decade in the field. I was overseas an average of 250 days a year. And I ran afoul of the FCPA. I pleaded guilty to violating the FCPA, and I ended up spending 14 and a half months in prison for it. So clearly I didn't get my company's compliance program, but that's no one's fault or responsibility but my own. But I still think it's a relevant question to those who work far away from home, often thinly supervised, and does a compliance program, again, that might have been developed from a regulatory perspective, is that inspiring and engaging people who work in these regions where local cultures might conflict with the rules? So if there are gaps in what might be defensible and what might be understood, how can they be mitigated? So today, I'm very pleased to welcome a broad range of perspectives from the regulatory, corporate, and legal sectors as to address best practices and how a program can be calibrated to both be commercially sensible as well as defensible in the event that there's an issue. And we're going to have plenty of time for your questions at the end. But right now, I'd like to turn it over to my panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit about their backgrounds. Jim?
Welcome, and we look forward to your comments and questions during this presentation as well. So for most of my career, I was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, initially with Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, where I was part of the Organized Crime Strike Force, and then for the latter part of my career, with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle, where I ran the corporate fraud task force and handled a number of bribery, corruption, and money laundering investigations, amongst other types of matters. At the end of my time at DOJ, because of my experience handling corruption cases, I was asked to serve as the legal advisor to Tanzania, where I worked hand in hand with the Prevention of Combating and Corruption Bureau and assisted them with their corruption investigations and conducted training throughout the country. Presently, I am a shareholder in a Denver-based law firm called Inman Flynn, and my practice is divided pretty evenly between a compliance-focused practice and a litigation practice. And my litigation practice includes both civil and criminal litigation, with the common thread being some type of regulatory focus or connection to it. And then finally, out of full disclosure, since they're a sponsor here, I'm on a consulting contract with Dow Jones in relation to a third-party due diligence compliance solution I developed called Risk Averter.
Thank you, Jim. Shari?
My name is Shari Brown. I'm a partner at Troutman Sanders. And my background includes the following. I've been a federal prosecutor in the Philadelphia U.S. Attorney's Office. And after that, I went to Mobil Oil Corporation, now ExxonMobil, where among the positions I held, the last position was the Secretary of the Ethics and Compliance Committee, as well as the Conflicts of Interest Committee, in which I developed an entire global compliance program for the company that was supposed to be more user-friendly than the other one we used to have. And I used to answer the hotline, so I know about hotline issues, and I would conduct internal investigations and or supervise or outside counsel with internal investigations. And from ExxonMobil, I then became a partner in a law firm where I have chaired FCPA compliance and government investigation groups in more than one international law firm. And I help clients today with a lot of their not only compliance issues, but internal investigations, not only with respect to DOJ and the SEC, but also a lot of investigations in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Kazakhstan, Europe, and various countries in Asia. And I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Shari. Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura Perkins. I'm an assistant chief in the FCPA unit at the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. I've been in the fraud section for about 9 years, doing FCPA cases primarily, and also some securities fraud and healthcare fraud. I did a brief stint in the Office of the Assistant Attorney General, advising the Assistant Attorney General and others on policy matters, case matters, things like that. Before my time at the department, I practiced in a law firm in Washington. And then sort of going back, I just want to take one step back. With regard to the FCPA unit, for those of you who don't know, the FCPA is slightly different than basically any other criminal statute, in that the fraud section has exclusive jurisdiction over the prosecution of FCPA cases. So for other criminal violations, a U.S. Attorney's Office can handle whatever violation occurs in their district. For FCPA cases, that's not the case. We can work in conjunction with a U.S. Attorney's Office, but all FCPA cases are handled out of the fraud section of the Department of Justice.
Thank you, Laura. So, Shari, let's start with you. So from your experience, starting as an AUSA to Mobil Oil, and now as counsel, have you seen the anti-bribery compliance landscape shift? And do you see programs as now pointing more towards true legitimacy in the field and addressing the tasks at hand among those in the workforce? Or do you see what one author recently described is a myopic focus on preventing government investigations and hence preventing government intervention?
That's a big question, and there's a lot of time here, so I'm not going to cover all the years I've been doing FCPA. But what I will tell you is that when I first started in the mid to late 90s, compliance programs in general were just written paper programs where the language was legalese. Even I didn't understand what was the behavior that was prohibited or where the risk areas were. And no one read the compliance policies and procedures because they were not user-friendly, and they always used the most complicated legal words that you can find that we don't even use in our legal writing today. And what I also found is at that time there were not a lot of enforcement actions to point to if you were a compliance officer, as I was, to be able to tell the business folks, hey, look, be careful, look what happened to this company or look what happened to that company. And I distinctly remember there was a feeling that the law was there, it wasn't heavily enforced, and why were the lawyers making so much of a fuss about it? Now, over time, the compliance programs have gotten more user-friendly, perhaps a little more illustrative and connected to a particular company's industry or business model. But with recession and economic downturns, I found that companies start looking for ways to cut costs, and they want a template or a cookie cutter program, which tends not to be terribly effective and doesn't really address the risk areas for your particular business model or your particular industry or company. And I think today what I see are, again, pressures on cost and compliance, a desire to use a lot of technology to do training and to assist with compliance, but in some instances, missing the boat when it comes to what I wouldn't call frontier countries, what I call our emerging countries. That's what I always say. And in where they have cultural norms and even different uses of language, where even when it's translated from English to the foreign language, what the conduct is that is prohibited may not be as clearly understood by someone in the emerging country. And I'll give you some examples of that later. So I think there is still room for improvement. I think going for templates and formulaic web-based training, there's a place for it. But if you're in a particularly high-risk operating country, or if your business model is one where you use a lot of third parties in high-risk countries, and that's how you business develop with state government-owned entities, then cookie cutter and template and web-based models may be a good start, but I still think there's a need to customize. And being willing to give the budgets for that customization in your company is something that I think when you hear from Laura, you will have the ammunition to do that.
A great point, Shari. And just from a personal perspective, corruption looks a lot different in Argentina than it does in Malaysia, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all problem, and certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. So Jim, how about you? You also bring in the AUSA perspective, and you talked about your time and your international experience. And you also have first-hand compliance program experience as well in your current work. So I read an article that you authored on foreign agents, and you addressed how to be prepared if the regulators come knocking. But how have you seen programs evolving? Is it all about preventing and policing with a rules-based program? Or have we reached a point where programs are more designed in partnership with the workforce, which the DOJ corporate compliance document actually references? And do you see programs as more calculated to those and calibrated to those real-world risks and hence better understood?
Let me first couch my answer with the comment that I'm generalizing a little bit. There's always exceptions, but when I first began examining compliance programs as a regulator from the outside looking in, it was really more form over substance. 9 times out of 10 is more a check-the-box approach. The company may have had an anti-corruption policy in place. Perhaps they had implemented online training, but beyond that, there wasn't much happening in corporate America when I started examining those programs when it came to anti-corruption compliance. Now, by the time I left DOJ in 2010, the landscape, in my view, had changed dramatically. I think that was largely due, in part at least, to the efforts of the Department of Justice and the SEC that stepped up enforcement in that area and also got the messaging out. It wasn't that they were starting to conduct investigations and bring cases, but they got the messaging out. And it was also due in large part to international cooperation. So there was a effort on the part of U.S. regulators to engage their foreign counterparts to help with those investigations. So after leaving government, I was doing risk assessments for companies. And what I noticed initially was they seemed to understand at that point than they did earlier in the process that more was needed. But at that point, to answer your question, I still saw it more as a effort to comply with the rules as opposed to a genuine effort to change the culture within the company. At that point, they were doing a bit more in some companies. I saw that they got the concept of how important it is to vet your third parties to make sure that they don't have a propensity to engage in corrupt conduct. Again, I think that was an extension in part of the fact that the DOJ and the SEC regulatory actions, 80% plus of those involve bribes paid by third parties of companies and not by employees themselves. More companies seemed to understand that it wasn't enough just to have check the box online training, that you also needed to do targeted in-person training of your key employees, regional compliance managers, and even with respect to high-risk third parties, of those third parties. I believe by then companies got it, that the tone at the top was important because there was numerous guidance that came out from DOJ in that respect through deferred prosecution agreements and non-prosecution agreements indicating the importance of that and what that meant to companies. But I think at that point in time, most companies still thought that a letter from the CEO sent out to its employees kind of checked that box. Now shifting to the present, I'm still doing risk assessments of companies' anti-corruption compliance programs. And to use your term, Richard, I think it's at this point calibrated for the most part to real-world risks more often than not. There's still the exceptions to that, but I think companies are starting to get it. A primary example of that is in the training area. I think companies understand now that you need to do in-person, enhanced training of your key employees, key regional compliance managers, third parties that are high-risk third parties that are doing business on your behalf. It needs to be in their native or local languages. And it has to be tailored to real-life situations and issues that are faced in that region, because as you mentioned, Richard, it can vary drastically from country to country what issues companies are facing. And so when I do that training, I include hypotheticals that are based on real-life scenarios for that very reason.
That's a great point. And, again, just from my frontline perspective, and I often share this with compliance teams, just a friendly reminder, the compliance program is not there to do the job of the compliance officer. It's there to help people in the field do their jobs, right? And what they're looking for is just a program that makes sense and looks to be like a complement to business success, not just a guardrail to sort of that legal and compliant behavior. So, Laura, when we look at the recent evaluation of corporate compliance programs, it has sections, and I find this fascinating, including shared commitment, operational integration, effectiveness of training, and now tone at the top is conduct at the top. And the one that surprised me the most, incentive systems. Laura, those all seem to be pointing toward impacting behaviors and corporate culture, addressing many of the rationalizations that can influence employee behaviors, as opposed to focusing on provisions of the law itself. So it's almost as if the government is stating, even informally, hey, don't look at us because from our perspective, a defensible program is one that's understood in the field. What's your view of that evaluation?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think from our perspective, a defensible program is one that's understood. Otherwise, it's not an effective program. A defensible program is a program that people understand, people follow, and that there are effective controls in place so that when people don't understand it or someone tries to get around it, there's a control in place to stop that. So I think that the questions that have been published recently are things that we within the unit and within the fraud section have asked companies for years to try to get at whether or not it really is just a paper program, because it's very easy to make something look good on paper. I have sat through countless compliance presentations from companies that come in and they have a lot of glossy sheets that they can hand out and say, look at our wonderful policies. We can check and tie to the different areas of the FCPA. But then when you try to get beyond just the glossy paper, there isn't a lot there. The company isn't able to demonstrate, people actually attended training, or we do X amount of audits a year to see if people actually understand the policies, if people are following the procedures. We go out and we do live trainings, and we listen to the questions that we get from the employees, and we incorporate those in upgrading our policies and procedures each year, because those questions are indicative to us of what the employees don't understand about our policies, and we use that information. So the questions that you see in sort of the recently published guidance are questions. I mean, obviously we won't ask them of every company. We don't ask every single question on there. We often ask questions that aren't on there, but those are things that are sort of demonstrative of what we're trying to get at when we're trying to understand what a company's pre-existing compliance program was before they appeared before us, obviously. And then, in the context of remediation, what have they done? What have they learned from the problems that they encountered? And what have they done to fill those holes, fix those gaps, whatever the case may be. And so those questions are aimed at sort of figuring that out, getting beyond just the nice presentation that, everyone can do.
Give an example of something not working in the field, even though the company spent a lot of money translating policies and procedures, training on policies and procedures. Subsequently, the company 2 years later did an audit of 8 countries and actually went to the countries with outside counsel and interviewed employees about certain risk areas. And I was one of the people asking questions, and I learned that the words were perfect in the procedures, but to give you an example, in one country, let's say Indonesia, I interviewed someone who said, I understand that we're not allowed to bribe or to give, get reimbursed for political donations to candidates, but, if I decide to do something with my own money, and I don't get reimbursed, then the company should not have liability. So they thought that was okay. Or if the company's policy said you could only spend X amount on a meal with a government official, but in that country it would be considered to be kind of an insult to only spend a small amount for lunch. And so they would use their own money from their own paycheck to pay for the meal that was worthy of that official and wouldn't seek reimbursement for their portion of it. Or on the corporate jet policy, if it was a company big enough to have a corporate jet, they felt if the company's operations were in a remote location and government officials could use the corporate jet, to do tours and plant tours, etc., if there was space on the jet to go into the city unrelated to business and the official and his spouse wanted a lift, then that was okay. And so it wasn't as though the policy wasn't written well. It's just that someone needed to take the time to go there and not just customize it, but to be with the employees in country and work with the local managers perhaps to come up with examples for that particular country that would make it more relevant and would get at this gap in understanding. And the company spent a huge amount of money on this, and they were actually surprised that employees thought they could just, in order for them to be successful overall in their job and dealing with this regulator, it was worth it to them to spend their own money on these things, and they didn't view it as illegal, and they volunteered it openly because in their mind they did not have any corrupt intent.
That's a great point, Shari. And if you're interested in behavioral theory, there's a wonderful book by a professor in Chicago. Her name is Ann Tenbrunsell, and the name of the book is Blind Spots. And she talks about how when a compliance program is just viewed as a set of rules, policies, and procedures, that it can actually distort the decision-making process, just like you shared, Shari, where someone looked at it and said, I can do this, and I'm not violating the company's policies. So I think that goes back to maybe ethical awareness, understanding not only the intended issues of and consequences of corruption, but what are the unintended consequences of corruption for people to really think about the consequences of their decisions.
Just one other thing to follow up on what Shari said. There's no way, obviously, you can cover everything in an anti-corruption policy, but one thing I try to do when I draft them for companies is to include examples in the policy of what's a violation of a particular rule in that policy and what isn't. Mm-hmm. So it makes it more real to the people that are reading it and to the people that are training on the policy.
Thank you. So, this morning at some of the opening sessions, there was a lot of discussion on, third-party risk. So, Laura, given that the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and now we have the recent ISO 37001 standard, both address incentive systems. But what's interesting is you might think, well, those are employee incentives. But the corporate compliance program document also talks about third-party incentives. That was another surprise. So what steps should an organization consider when they're talking about promoting a culture of compliance amongst its third parties? So when I was in the field, I heard a lot of, hey, what our agent and what our third party does with their profit is absolutely none of our business. So have we reached a point where you think there's an awareness that when it comes to third parties, Laura, that what a company doesn't know or what an individual doesn't know is exactly what can hurt them?
So, I think that companies have come to realize that the sort of sell to the border, agent does what the agent wants to do with their profit, with their margin. From what I have seen, I think that the message has gotten through to companies that that's not an appropriate way to do business. So it's not only having sort of a compliance program or trainings for the third party, which I have seen an increased amount of. A lot of companies train their third parties now pursuant to almost the same training program that they do for their own employees, and they also have them sign certifications. But it's also teaching the employees, so not the message that you got, the exact opposite. That it is imperative that we understand what our third parties are going to be doing with the margin, or if they don't want to give us complete clarity, it's imperative that we at least have that conversation. that we tell the third party that, we are a compliant company, and, while we understand you're going to have a margin, there are permissible things to do with it and impermissible things to do with it. And that the employee who is engaging with the third party understand those rules, and have that employee, as well as if there is a training for the third party, have that message sent sort of repeatedly to the third party. I've seen, obviously a lot more companies are doing due diligence on their third parties. So we're seeing a lot more of that now than when I first started. So there has been an increase, and I think that companies do recognize now that that it is a company's problem if a third party acting on their behalf is acting improperly.
That's a great point. And, for people on the front lines, when they really, I think, represent themselves as ethics and integrity ambassadors and share right away with their agents and intermediaries and distributors, we don't engage in corruption, not because my compliance department says I can't, I don't, right? That's a very strong message. And we're going to retain audit rights. You can spend a lot of money on due diligence, but when you deliver that sort of message, a corrupt or potentially corrupt third party doesn't want to do business with that kind of company. And most likely they're going to go look for another supplier who might have a different outlook on ethics and integrity.
And you also need to be sure that your messaging to your third parties is consistent with the messaging overall to your employees. So it should be one and the same. Another thing important to examine with respect to third parties is the incentives that you have in place. You need to make sure that they're aligned with your goal of promoting a culture of compliance and a culture of zero tolerance when it comes to payment of bribes. So, for example, if you're allowing your third-party sales agents to be paid excessive commissions based upon sales, that arguably provides an incentive to them to use some of that money if they get it up front, if there's an advance for payment of the bribe, or if they're being paid on the back end to increase their sales through the payment of bribes so they can get that compensation. So it's very important as well to look at how they are compensated and make sure they're compensated in a way that aligns with your overall goal to promote a culture of compliance.
You mentioned something about audit rights, and while we all include them in our anti-corruption terms, particularly with joint ventures or with third-party consultants, I have rarely found a company that is anxious to trigger the audit rights, even when they have the opportunity to do so. And I don't really understand the thinking on it, but some comments have been, if your client requires audit rights from its joint venture partner and it's reciprocal, there's kind of an uneasiness about triggering those prematurely or before you really have to, because when the reverse is requested of you, you may not want some different company that you may compete with in other markets, but that you're joint venturing with in this market, looking at your books and records. So we have to have it to satisfy the regulators, but I see as a practical matter, the use of audit rights, actually triggering them, is rarely used. But maybe you've had a different experience, Jim?
Yeah, no, I found the same thing, and what I advise my clients, putting on my former regulator hat, and maybe Laura can speak to this too, is it doesn't really do much good. It does some good, but not a lot of good from a regulator's perspective to have a contract provision that gives you audit rights if you never exercise them. You should be periodically exercising those rights, either when red flags surface, or even if not, at least with respect to those third parties that you've identified as being in that very high-risk category.
Yeah, I will say that one of the questions, and I admittedly don't recall whether it's on our list or not of sort of the new questions that were released, but one of the questions that we almost always ask a company is how often do you exercise your audit rights on your third parties? Tell us, like, when was the last time for X third party that you exercised it? What was the response? What did you look at? I mean, a lot of details about that. Similarly, we ask, in your third party due diligence, how many of the third parties that you've conducted due diligence on failed? Because that demonstrates to us whether or not you're actually doing an effective job or not. You can do due diligence a variety of different ways. And so if third parties actually fail, that shows us that you're have probably a more fulsome due diligence process. I mean, if it's if you've only vetted 3 people and all 3 passed, I mean that's not necessarily a bad sign. But if you vetted 4,000 third parties and no one has failed, that we'll look at that and question as to why.
Right. So one last question we'll ask each one of you, and then we'll spend some time to hear your questions as well. So Shari, let's start with you. Let's say we have a well-intentioned compliance program, well-designed, clearly written, and even customized for local laws and customs and language. What factors have you seen from all of your career perspectives that can still contribute to high-risk behaviors that can result in a violation of policy or law? And here, let's just speak about anti-corruption or other issues as well. So I often talk about how when commercial objectives and incentives run afoul of market realities, that can point to risky behavior. So what are some of the examples you have seen, Shari, where what you expect to be happening isn't happening?
Well, I'll do a couple of quick ones. I think everyone has perhaps done something where your company wants to do a new market entry or get a product out there, and things are happening really fast, and you have a policy that says you have to have a written agreement in place, but the timing on taking certain steps with a third party might prevent you from finalizing all the terms, so you go forward without something in writing with the third party because the business people have already asked the third party to act for the company. Well, that is usually a recipe for disaster, not because sometimes the business people don't get out ahead of the agreement or the lawyers or compliance, because that happens often, but because if the business folks aren't willing to respect the processes that are in place to protect the company and them from misconduct by the third party, that if they are doing that at the beginning, then it's probably going to happen throughout the course of the dealings with that third party. Another thing that I think is really important, and we talk about due diligence, what diligence is due. Just because you say you did due diligence doesn't mean that what you did even begins to meet a standard for whatever the transaction is or whatever activity that third party or joint venture partner is going to be engaged in. So make sure that the diligence that you do is commensurate with the role and type of relationship or operational involvement that you will have with that third party. And then finally, what I think is a lot of companies set all these things up, but if you're not willing to spend the money periodically, every 2 years at least, to really monitor the behavior and compliance, then things can be happening out there after you've done the initial training. You won't know about it until it's really not a red flag, but an actual problem. And periodic monitoring may seem expensive, particularly if you're going to all your high-risk countries every 2 to 3 years. But the cost of an enforcement action and hiring outside counsel to help you with that dwarfs the cost of the monitoring. So if you need tools and ammunition to convince your management that this is worth doing, look at some of the SEC filings and see how much companies are spending on outside counsel apart from the fines and penalties they're paying.
Yeah, it's a great point. Before I turn it over to Jim, to add a war story to your perspective, I was doing business with an intermediary in South America, no indication of corruption or corrupt intent, but there was an election, there was a new president, and he shares with me that, hey, we've got a new Minister of Interior, a new Minister of Defense. Those were my end users, which means we're going to get all new people seated at procurement, and those are my buddies. And he said, and this was a phone call monitored by federal law enforcement, he said they know they only, quote unquote, have a few years to make their pension. So there's a case where someone totally changed on the continuum of corruption due to regime change. So that's just probably one factor of many that I think shows the importance of interval monitoring. Jim?
So one thing I'd say, just to follow up on what Sherry and Richard said, is was thinking while they were talking. You can have a good tone at the top, and you can still not have a culture of compliance. We've kind of been focused on the importance of the tone at the top, but a compliance manager, and I see this happen time and time again, they are pressured constantly by the business people to make exceptions to policies, to move things so quickly that they can't reflect on what the right decision should be with respect to their policy and the like. So another thing that's key, I think, when it comes to having a culture of compliance throughout your entire organization is actually the tone in the middle. Right. Middle management has to buy into it as well. And I think that requires interaction and coordination between the C-suite and those middle managers, facilitated by the compliance officers. Because it's not really the role of the compliance officer to do it, but to facilitate it, in my view.
So the government always gets the last word. Laura?
I'll be quick so that you all can ask questions that you may have. But I think that what we see a lot of is there's a lot of focus on the compliance program. Companies have really caught on to implementing a compliance program. There's a lot less focus and a lot less attention paid to the controls and putting in place proper controls for when you did a ton of training, you wrote these wonderful policies, people either still don't get it or they just choose not to follow it. And what controls do you have in place at the company to stop that from happening, to stop the company's assets and monies from going out of the company? And that's not just from a corruption perspective, but embezzlement. I mean, a variety of different things that can happen if you don't have the proper controls in place. And so I think that is one place that, from what I have seen, companies haven't come as far as they have with compliance programs and training, and maybe it's because it's pretty expensive, I think, in some instances, to put in place the financial controls that you need. But there's a lot less attention and effort put in the controls perspective than there is for the compliance program.
Thank you. So we enjoy hearing your questions and observations. Tony?
All indications that we have received internally, as well as what sort of I have seen externally of speeches that have been given by administration officials, are that the FCPA will continue to be enforced in the way in which and with the vigor with which it has been for the past how since it started sort of the vigorous enforcement. So certainly the type of enforcement under the last administration will continue. I will say, as with all of my comments today, they're my thoughts and not those of the department. But there's the only tweak that I can see in that is staffing. We're under a hiring freeze. The entire department is under a hiring freeze. So as people leave, if we have less prosecutors, we can obviously handle less cases. We're doing a lot with U.S. attorneys' offices to sort of leverage the additional resources in U.S. attorneys' offices, as well as there's a lot of outreach to our foreign counterparts. And there has been tremendous progress on that front with regard to foreign enforcement efforts. As far as sort of scaling back, there have been no indications that the administration intends to scale back the enforcement of the FCPA. But again, if we have less prosecutors, presumably we can handle a little bit less cases. But we've been sent sort of the message when the hiring freeze was first put in place, FCPA was exempted from it, and very few groups were. So that's sort of a counter to sort of what I had seen in the press as far as, maybe the FCPA won't be enforced. But we were one of the few sections and units that were exempted from the original hiring freeze.
Also, if I could just add to that, since President Reagan made that statement, the field has leveled quite a bit internationally. There's the UK Bribery Act now, and the SFO is starting to take some strong enforcement efforts. There's a stronger Canadian law, and they're starting to bring some enforcement efforts. Mexico has a law that's starting to be utilized. Brazil has a new law in their books. We'll see what happens there. China, believe it or not, is starting to do more about not only corruption from their own public officials, but from foreign companies that are paying bribes to win work within China. So I think the field has changed dramatically since that comment was first made. And I think the momentum is such that it'd be very difficult, despite changes in administration, for the U.S. to back away from it. That's just my personal view on it.
But I think in part you were getting to the point of the cultural custom of maybe before you do business, you exchange gifts, things of that nature, or there's maybe a nice meal. Big companies are still having some sort of gift exchange, but it's done incredibly transparently and usually as part of a ceremony. And often, whatever the gift is, it is clearly not something that is for the personal benefit or use of the official. I think of recently our president went to Saudi Arabia and he received something that looked like it was a solid gold medal from the king of Saudi Arabia. And I suspect because it was gold, it probably had diamonds in it too. But I doubt that he is going to keep that in his personal collection. So I think there is a recognition that at a certain level and for a first meeting, there may be an exchange of gifts that are kind of unique to the cultures, something uniquely American and something from the other country that is of their culture, but it should not be for the personal use of the recipient, and it should be something that if, like, for example, in an energy company, if a president of an oil company gets something from someone, they put it in a cabinet in the company that guests and visitors can visit, and it's cataloged and logged. And I think even the State Department requires that of certain gifts that are given at a certain level to diplomats. They're allowed to accept them, but not in their personal capacity and for their personal use. But I don't know all the rules, but I do know we're not saying you go and insult people when you go to a country, but you're really in the red zone, so you need to coordinate with your counsel on what can be given, how it can be given, how you record it, and the transparency with which you give it. The more fanfare and photographers and pictures, of the exchange, the better.
Well, thank you, Shari. I want to thank my fellow panelists for sharing your experience and perspective. And thank you, everyone. I know we're up against a break right now, so we're here. We're happy to take more questions and look forward to seeing you later on. Thank you.
Thank you.